The unrelenting Arizona sun beat down on Eleanor Taylor as she hurried along the dusty main street of Old Tucson, clutching her market basket tighter when the whispers followed her like vengeful ghosts. The year was 1876, and in a town where everyone knew not only your name but also the secrets you tried to bury, Eleanor had become the favorite subject of malicious gossip that spread faster than wildfire in the summer heat. "There she goes," came a whisper just loud enough for her to hear. "Poor thing thinks she can still hold her head up after what her daddy did." Eleanor quickened her pace, the heels of her worn boots clicking against the wooden boardwalk. At 22, she had already endured more than most women twice her age. Her father, once the town's respected doctor, had fallen into disgrace after being accused of stealing morphine from his own practice. He had died 3 months ago, some said from shame. Others from the whiskey he'd used to drown it, leaving Eleanor alone with nothing but a tarnished name and a small house on the edge of town. She kept her eyes fixed ahead, refusing to acknowledge Mrs. Peterson and her daughter, who had fallen conspicuously silent as she passed. Just last year, these same women had taken tea in her father's parlor, praising his gentle hands and healing touch. Now they acted as if the Taylor name was a contagion to be avoided. "Miss Taylor." The deep voice startled her, and she nearly dropped her basket of meager supplies. Standing before her was Preston Ryder, his tall frame blocking the harsh sunlight. The shadow he cast provided momentary relief from both the heat and the stares that followed her. "Mr. Ryder," she acknowledged with a slight nod, not quite meeting his eyes. Preston Ryder had appeared in Old Tucson 8 months ago, taking work at the Wilcox Ranch outside town. He was not like the other cowboys who came through, loud, brash men who spent their pay on whiskey and women at the saloon. Preston was quiet, observant, and there was something in his eyes that spoke of experiences beyond the open range. At 30 years old, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had seen much of life but hadn't been broken by it. "Allow me," he said, reaching for her basket. "I can manage, thank you," Eleanor replied, the pride in her voice unmistakable. "I don't doubt it, Miss Taylor. But a gentleman offers assistance regardless." There was the hint of a smile on his sun-weathered face, and Eleanor found herself relinquishing the basket. They walked in silence for several paces, the stares of the townspeople following them with undisguised interest. Eleanor felt her cheeks flush with both embarrassment and anger. Now they would have something new to whisper about the disgraced doctor's daughter keeping company with the mysterious cowboy. "They have little else to occupy their minds," Preston said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. "Small towns breed small thinking." Eleanor glanced at him, surprised by his perception. "And what brings you to accompany a social pariah, Mr. Ryder? Surely you value your standing in this community more than that." His laugh was unexpected, a warm, genuine sound that seemed to rise from deep within his chest. "Miss Taylor, I've never put much stock in what folks think of me. Life's too short to live by others' judgments." They reached the edge of town where Eleanor's modest home stood, slightly removed from the others as if the town itself had tried to push it away. Preston handed back her basket, his fingers briefly brushing against hers. "Thank you for the escort," she said formally, though something in her wanted him to stay a moment longer. "My pleasure." He tipped his hat, then hesitated. "Miss Taylor, I'm riding out to check some grazing land for Mr. Wilcox tomorrow. There's a spot up in the hills where the wildflowers are just coming into bloom. Would you consider accompanying me? It's a fine view of the territory." Eleanor stared at him, caught off guard by the invitation. It had been months since anyone in town had extended any sort of social gesture toward her. Propriety demanded she refuse, An unmarried woman did not go riding alone with a man, particularly not one she barely knew. But propriety had done little to protect her from the town's cruelty. I couldn't possibly, she said, though the refusal lacked conviction. Preston nodded, accepting her answer without challenge. The offer stands should you reconsider. Good day, Miss Taylor. He turned to leave, then added, sometimes the view is clearer from a distance. Makes it easier to see what matters and what doesn't. As Eleanor watched him walk away, his words echoed in her mind. That night, as she prepared her solitary meal, she could hear children playing in the street, their laughter drifting through her open window. She had once been part of this community, had once belonged. Now she was an outsider in the only place she'd ever called home. Morning came with a decision already formed in her mind. Eleanor dressed with care in her one good riding skirt and jacket, pinning her honey-brown hair beneath a modest hat. She told herself it was merely an afternoon's respite from the oppressive atmosphere of the town, nothing more. Preston arrived precisely at the time he had mentioned, leading a gentle mare alongside his own horse. His expression revealed nothing when he saw her waiting on the porch, but there was a warmth in his eyes that made her heart beat a little faster. You reconsidered, he stated simply. It seems I did, Eleanor replied, attempting to keep her voice light. Though I fear this will only add fuel to the fire of gossip. Preston's smile was subtle but genuine. Let it burn, then. Some things need to be reduced to ash before new growth can begin. Their ride began in comfortable silence, the horses picking their way out of town and into the open landscape. Eleanor felt the tension in her shoulders begin to ease as the distance between her and Old Tucson increased. The Arizona territory stretched out before them rugged, untamed, and indifferent to human concerns. My father wasn't a thief, she said suddenly, the words spilling out unbidden. He used the morphine to treat patients who couldn't afford to pay miners, ranch hands, a young mother with consumption. He never took a cent for it. Preston didn't respond immediately, allowing her words to settle in the space between them. Mercy isn't always recognized as such, he finally said, especially when it doesn't follow the rules people have decided upon. The rules, Eleanor echoed bitterly. The town decided he was guilty without a trial. They turned their backs on him after 20 years of service. He delivered their babies, set their broken bones, sat with them through fevers and accidents, and in the end they let him die alone. Not alone, Preston corrected gently. He had you. Tears stung Eleanor's eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely. It wasn't enough. I wasn't enough. That's not a burden you should carry, Miss Taylor. They had begun to ascend a winding trail that led into the foothills. The vegetation changed as they climbed more juniper and pine, less cactus and scrub. The air felt different here, cleaner somehow, as if the elevation had lifted them above more than just the dusty plains. Call me Eleanor, she said after a while. If we're to be social outcasts together, we might as well dispense with formality. His laugh returned, that genuine sound that made her want to hear it again. Eleanor, then, and I'm Preston to you. They reached a plateau where Preston suggested they rest the horses. He helped her dismount, his hands strong and sure at her waist. The brief contact left her flustered, and she turned away quickly to hide the color in her cheeks. The view was even more magnificent than he had promised. The town of Old Tucson looked small and insignificant from this height, just a cluster of buildings in the vast landscape. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still bearing traces of winter snow despite the spring warmth. It's beautiful, Eleanor breathed, taking it all in. It puts things in perspective, Preston agreed. From up here, the concerns of the town seem rather small, don't they? Eleanor nodded, understanding what he meant. The gossip, the judgment, the painful isolation from this vantage point, they seemed as transient as shadows passing over the land. Preston spread a blanket on the ground and produced a simple but thoughtful picnic from his saddlebag: bread, cheese, dried fruit, and a small flask of water. They ate in companionable silence, the distant call of a hawk the only interruption. "You're not from around here," Eleanor observed, studying his profile. "No," he confirmed. "I grew up in Missouri, left home at 16 after my mother passed. Been working my way west ever since." "What brought you to Old Tucson?" Preston was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the horizon. "I was looking for something, I suppose. A place that felt right. I've worked ranches in 5 territories, driven cattle up to Kansas, even tried my hand at mining in Colorado. Nothing seemed to fit." "And does Old Tucson fit?" Eleanor asked, curious despite herself. His gaze shifted to her face, and there was something in his expression that made her breath catch. "Parts of it do." The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibility. Then Preston looked away, gesturing toward a patch of wildflowers near the edge of the plateau. "Those are what I wanted to show you," he said. "Desert paintbrush. They only bloom for a few weeks each spring." Eleanor moved closer to examine the vibrant red blooms. "They're stunning. So much color in such a harsh place." "Beauty finds a way," Preston said, watching her rather than the flowers. "Even in the most unlikely circumstances." Eleanor felt his words as more than casual observation, but before she could respond, a distant rumble of thunder broke the moment. Looking up, she saw dark clouds gathering to the west, moving quickly in their direction. "A spring storm," Preston said, already gathering their things. "We should head back before it hits." They packed up hastily and mounted their horses. The temperature had dropped noticeably, and the wind had picked up, carrying with it the scent of rain. They had made it halfway down the trail when the first fat droplets began to fall, quickly giving way to a steady downpour. "There's a line shack not far from here," Preston shouted over the intensifying storm. "We can wait it out there." Eleanor nodded, pulling her jacket tighter around her. The rain had already soaked through her clothes and she was beginning to shiver. She followed Preston's lead as he guided them off the main trail and through a stand of pines to a small, weathered cabin nestled among the trees. Inside, the shack was spare but dry. A single room with a small stove, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and a narrow bed pushed against one wall. Preston quickly set about building a fire in the stove while Eleanor stood dripping by the door, suddenly aware of the impropriety of their situation. "You're shivering," Preston observed, concern evident in his voice. "There are some old blankets in the chest there. You should get out of those wet clothes." Eleanor's eyes widened at the suggestion, and Preston quickly amended, "I'll wait outside on the porch until you've changed. The blankets aren't fancy, but they're clean and dry." True to his word, Preston stepped outside despite the continuing rain. Eleanor found the chest and pulled out several rough wool blankets. With trembling fingers from cold or nervousness, she couldn't tell she removed her sodden jacket, blouse, and skirt, wrapping one of the largest blankets around herself like a shawl. "You can come in now," she called, her voice sounding strange to her own ears. Preston re-entered, just as wet as she had been. Without comment, he took another blanket and turned his back to remove his own shirt. Eleanor caught a glimpse of tanned skin and the lean muscles of his back before she quickly averted her eyes, a flush spreading across her face that had nothing to do with the warmth beginning to emanate from the stove. They sat in awkward silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the steady drumming of rain on the roof. Preston had draped their wet garments near the stove to dry, a domestic gesture that somehow made the situation more intimate rather than less. "I apologize for this situation," he finally said, breaking the silence. "It wasn't my intention to compromise your reputation further." Eleanor found herself laughing, the sound surprising both of them. "My reputation? Mr. Ryder Preston, I believe that ship has sailed. The good people of Old Tucson have already determined my character, and no amount of proper behavior on my part will change their minds." Something darkened in Preston's expression. "It isn't right, the way they've treated you. A community should support its own through hardship, not cast them out." "Perhaps that's why I agreed to come with you today," Eleanor admitted softly. "I needed to remember that there's a world beyond those judgmental stares, beyond the whispers that follow me down the street." Preston moved to sit beside her on the edge of the bed, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "What will you do? Will you stay in Old Tucson?" It was a question Eleanor had asked herself countless times over the past 3 months. "I don't know," she confessed. "It's the only home I've ever known. My mother is buried there, and now my father too. But sometimes—" She hesitated, hardly daring to voice the thought. "Sometimes I think about just leaving, starting fresh somewhere where no one knows the name Taylor or what it supposedly represents." "And what's stopping you?" Eleanor considered the question. "Fear, I suppose, fear of the unknown, and perhaps a stubborn desire not to be driven away, not to let them win." "Those are worthy considerations," Preston acknowledged. "But there's a difference between retreating in defeat and choosing a new path on your own terms." The rain continued to fall as they talked, sharing pieces of themselves that perhaps neither had intended to reveal. Eleanor learned that Preston had once been engaged to a banker's daughter in St. Louis, but she had broken it off when he refused to give up his wandering ways for a position in her father's bank. He told her about working cattle drives, about sleeping under stars so bright and numerous they seemed close enough to touch, about the freedom he'd found in the wide, open spaces of the West. In turn, Eleanor shared memories of her father, his gentle hands and booming laugh, his dedication to healing, the way he would sit up all night with a sick child regardless of whether the family could pay. She spoke of her mother, who had died of influenza when Eleanor was 15, and how she had taken over the running of their household, becoming her father's assistant in his practice. "He taught me everything he knew," she said with quiet pride. "How to set bones, stitch wounds, deliver babies. I helped him with it all." "You're a healer too, then," Preston observed. Eleanor shook her head. "Just his assistant. Women aren't doctors. Perhaps not in title, but in skill and heart. I'd wager you know more about medicine than most men with fancy diplomas hanging on their walls." The storm began to abate as the afternoon wore on, sunlight eventually breaking through the clouds and streaming through the cabin's single window. Their clothes had dried by the stove's heat, and they dressed with awkward courtesy, turning away from each other in the small space. As they prepared to leave, Eleanor found herself reluctant to return to town, to step back into the role of social outcast. Preston seemed to sense her hesitation. "We could stay a little longer," he suggested. "The trail will be muddy for a while yet." Eleanor knew she should insist on leaving immediately. They had already spent hours alone together in a manner that would scandalize the town if known, but the thought of returning to her empty house, to the isolation that awaited her, made her decision easy. "A little longer," she agreed. They sat together on the cabin's small porch, watching as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. The landscape glistened after the rain, every leaf and stone washed clean and vibrant. "I come up here sometimes," Preston admitted. "When the bunkhouse gets too crowded or the work too monotonous, it helps to see things from a different perspective." "Is that why you brought me here? For a different perspective, Preston turned to look at her, his eyes serious. Partly. And partly because I've watched you walk through that town with your head high despite everything they've thrown at you, and I admired your courage. I wanted you to know that someone saw your strength. Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. No one had acknowledged her struggle, let alone praised her for facing it. It doesn't feel like strength most days, she confessed. Most days it feels like simple survival. Survival is no simple thing, Eleanor. It's the most fundamental kind of strength there is. The way he said her name with a softness that belied his rugged exterior sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air. She was acutely aware of his presence beside her, of the narrowing space between them as he leaned slightly closer. "We should head back," she said reluctantly, rising to her feet. "Before it gets dark." Preston nodded, though she thought she saw a flicker of disappointment in his eyes. They rode down the hillside in companionable silence, the setting sun casting long shadows ahead of them. As the outline of Old Tucson came into view, Eleanor felt a familiar heaviness settle over her. Preston must have noticed the change in her posture. "We leave them behind, you know," he said quietly. Eleanor glanced at him questioningly. "The whispers, the stares, the judgment, they only have power if we carry them with us. Up there," he nodded toward the hills they'd left behind, "they can't reach us. We leave them behind." His words resonated with something deep inside her, a longing for freedom she hadn't fully acknowledged. "It's a nice thought," she said, "but we have to come back down eventually." "Do we?" Preston's question hung in the air between them, laden with implication. Before Eleanor could form a response, they were approaching the edge of town. Lights had begun to appear in windows as dusk settled, and the saloon was coming to life with the sounds of a piano and men's laughter. The normality of it all struck Eleanor as strange after the day they'd shared. Preston escorted her to her door, dismounting to help her from her horse. "Thank you for joining me today," he said formally, aware they might be observed. "Thank you for the invitation," Eleanor replied with equal formality, though her heart was racing with unspoken emotions. It was illuminating. Preston held her gaze for a long moment. "May I call on you again?" The question was simple, but its implications were not. To accept his courtship would be to invite even more gossip, more disapproval from a town that had already decided her worth. But to refuse would be to deny the connection she felt with this man who saw her strength when others saw only shame. "Yes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I would like that." His smile was worth whatever consequences might follow. "Good night, then, Eleanor Taylor." "Good night, Preston Ryder." She watched him ride away, leading her borrowed mare back toward the ranch. Only when he had disappeared from sight did she enter her house, closing the door on a town that suddenly seemed smaller than it had that morning. The next weeks brought a change to Eleanor's life that she hadn't thought possible. Preston called on her regularly, sometimes bringing small gifts, a book of poetry, wildflowers from the hills, once a jar of honey from a hive he'd discovered on ranch land. They took rides together, always properly distanced from town but increasingly comfortable with each other. The gossip, as expected, flourished. Eleanor heard whispers as she passed the general store about that Taylor girl setting her cap for the cowboy, and birds of a feather, suggesting Preston must have secrets of his own to be interested in her. But something had shifted within her. The words still stung, but they didn't wound as deeply as before. "They're saying you're only courting me because no respectable woman would have you," she told Preston one afternoon as they walked along the creek that ran behind her house. His laugh rang out, startling a pair of doves from a nearby tree. "And what terrible secret am I supposedly hiding? Murder, thievery, a wife in every territory. They haven't decided yet, Eleanor replied, finding herself smiling despite the malicious nature of the gossip. But they're certain it must be something dreadful. Preston stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression suddenly serious. Does it bother you what they say? Eleanor considered the question honestly. Less than it did. But yes, sometimes. Not for myself so much anymore, but for you. You didn't ask to be dragged into my disgrace. Eleanor, he said her name with a gentleness that made her heart ache. I chose this. I chose you. And I'd do it again, regardless of what small minds might think. It was the closest he'd come to declaring his feelings, and Eleanor felt her pulse quicken. They had maintained a proper distance in their interactions, despite the growing affection between them. Preston had been careful not to compromise her further, though there had been moments of lingering touch when he helped her from her horse, a gaze held too long across a supper table that suggested he wanted more. "Why did you choose me?" she asked, emboldened by his words. "There are other women in town, women without my complications." Preston reached for her hand, his calloused fingers entwining with hers. "Because from the first moment I saw you walking down that street with your head high despite everything, I recognized something in you that called to me. A resilience, a fire that wouldn't be put out by other people's cruelty. Because when you smile, really smile, not the polite one you put on for show, it lights up everything around you." He paused, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. "And because when I'm with you, I don't feel the need to keep moving on. For the first time in my life, I want to stay." Eleanor stared at him, overwhelmed by his honesty and the depth of feeling behind his words. No one had ever spoken to her this way, had ever seen her so clearly or valued what they saw. "Preston, her response was cut short by the sound of approaching horses. They turned to see Sheriff Matthews riding toward them, accompanied by two men Eleanor didn't recognize. The sheriff's expression was grim as he reined in his horse. "Ryder," he acknowledged with a nod. "Miss Taylor, sorry to intrude, but I need a word with Mr. Ryder here." Preston released Eleanor's hand but stayed close to her side. "What can I do for you, Sheriff?" Matthews gestured to the men beside him. "These gentlemen are from the Wells Fargo office in Tucson. Seems there was a robbery 2 months back in Prescott, and they're tracking down a suspect." Eleanor felt Preston tense beside her. "And what does this have to do with me?" One of the men, dressed in a formal black suit despite the heat, spoke up. "We're looking for a man who matches your description, Mr. Ryder. Tall, dark hair, scar on the right forearm. He was going by the name Parker Reynolds at the time." "I have no scar," Preston said calmly, pushing up his sleeve to reveal unmarked skin. "And I've never used any name but my own." The man frowned, clearly disappointed. "Can you account for your whereabouts on April 15th? I was here, working at the Wilcox Ranch." "Mr. Wilcox can verify that, as can the other hands." Sheriff Matthews nodded. "I already spoke to Jim Wilcox. He confirms Ryder's been working steady since last fall, never missed a day." The Wells Fargo men exchanged glances. "We'll need to check a few more details," the one in the suit said. "No offense meant, Mr. Ryder, but we have to be thorough." "None taken," Preston replied evenly. "I understand you're just doing your job." The men tipped their hats to Eleanor and rode off, leaving her and Preston alone again. She studied his face, looking for any sign of deception or concern, but found only mild annoyance. "Are you all right?" she asked once the men were out of earshot. Preston sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Fine. It's not the first time I've been mistaken for someone else. When you've traveled as much as I have, it happens." Eleanor wanted to believe him, but a seed of doubt had been planted. What did she really know about Preston Ryder, beyond what he had chosen to tell her? The town's whispers came back to her. There must be something wrong with him to court the disgraced doctor's daughter. "Eleanor," Preston said softly, reading her expression. "Look at me. I am exactly who I've told you I am. No more, no less." She searched his eyes and found only sincerity there. "I believe you," she said, and was surprised to find it was true. Whatever else Preston might be, she trusted him in a way she had trusted few people since her father's death. "Good," he said, relief evident in his voice. "Because what I was trying to say before we were interrupted is important." Eleanor's heart began to race again. "What were you trying to say?" Preston took both her hands in his. "That I love you, Eleanor Taylor. That I want to build a life with you if you'll have me." The words hung in the air between them, momentous and transformative. Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes, but for once they were born of joy, not sorrow. "I love you too," she whispered, the admission both frightening and freeing. "But Preston, are you sure?" "The town, to hell with the town," he interrupted, a fierceness in his voice she hadn't heard before. "We leave them behind, remember. We can start fresh somewhere else, somewhere no one knows us or cares about our past, or we can stay and face them together if that's what you want. All that matters is that we're together." The conviction in his voice swept away her remaining doubts. Eleanor had spent months thinking she had lost everything when her father died, but standing here with Preston, she realized that wasn't true. She had found something precious and rare, a love that saw her clearly and valued her completely. "Together," she agreed, her voice stronger now. "Wherever that might be." Preston's smile was radiant as he pulled her closer, one hand coming up to cup her cheek. "May I kiss you, Eleanor Taylor?" In answer, she rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, a tentative exploration that quickly deepened into something more profound. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Eleanor felt as if something fundamental had shifted in her world. "Marry me," Preston said, the words both a question and a declaration. "Not someday, not when things settle down. Soon. Next week, if you're willing." The boldness of the proposal startled a laugh from Eleanor. "Next week? Is that even possible? The circuit judge comes through on Tuesday. We could be married by Wednesday afternoon." The speed of it all should have frightened her, but instead Eleanor felt only certainty. She had spent too long allowing others to define her life, her worth. It was time to claim her own path. "Yes," she said simply. "Wednesday." Preston's whoop of joy startled a nearby bird from its perch. He lifted her off her feet and spun her around, both of them laughing like children. When he set her down, his expression grew serious again. "I don't have much to offer you yet," he admitted. "I've saved most of my wages, but it's not a fortune." "I don't need a fortune," Eleanor assured him. "Just you." The days leading up to the wedding passed in a blur of preparations and decisions. Preston spoke to his employer, Mr. Wilcox, who surprised them both by offering Preston a position as foreman at a new ranch he was establishing near Flagstaff. "It's good grazing land and far enough from town that you'll have peace," the older man told them. "There's a cabin already built that would do for a married couple starting out. Needs some work, but it's solid." Eleanor was touched by the offer, recognizing it as the gift it was, a fresh start away from the whispers and judgment of Old Tucson. She spent the days sorting through her belongings, deciding what to take and what to leave behind. The house itself would be sold, the proceeds giving them a modest cushion as they began their new life. On the morning of her wedding day, Eleanor woke to a knock at her door. Opening it, she found Mrs. Wilcox standing on her porch, holding a large box. "May I come in, dear?" The older woman asked kindly. Surprised, Eleanor stepped aside. Mrs. Wilcox had always been polite to her in town, but they had never been particularly close. "I brought you something," Mrs. Wilcox said, setting the box on the table and removing the lid. Inside was a wedding dress of cream-colored silk, simply cut but elegant. "It was my daughter's," Mrs. Wilcox explained. "She's in San Francisco now with her husband and wouldn't mind you borrowing it. Every bride should have something special to wear on her day." Eleanor touched the fabric reverently. "It's beautiful, but I couldn't possibly—" "You can and you will," Mrs. Wilcox interrupted with gentle firmness. "And I'll help you get ready. It's not right for a bride to prepare alone." Tears threatened again as Eleanor recognized the kindness being offered. "Thank you," she managed, her voice thick with emotion. Mrs. Wilcox smiled, patting her hand. "Preston is a good man. My husband thinks very highly of him. You deserve some happiness, child, after everything you've endured." With Mrs. Wilcox's help, Eleanor dressed in the borrowed gown, arranging her hair with sprigs of desert wildflowers that Preston had sent over that morning. Looking in the mirror, she hardly recognized herself. The woman who gazed back at her looked hopeful, radiant even, a far cry from the defensive, wounded creature she had been just months before. The ceremony itself was simple, held in the parlor of the Wilcox home with only a few guests in attendance, Mr. and Mrs. Wilcox, the ranch cook who had become Preston's friend, and to Eleanor's surprise, Dr. Wilson, who had taken over her father's practice. "Your father was my mentor in medical school," he told her quietly before the ceremony. "I never believed the accusations against him. He was a good man who taught me that healing comes before profit. I'm sorry I didn't speak up more forcefully when he was alive." His words healed something in Eleanor that she hadn't realized was still raw. "Thank you," she said, squeezing his hand. "That means a great deal to me." When Preston entered the room, his eyes found hers immediately, and everything else seemed to fade away. He looked different in his formal suit, his usually unruly hair tamed for the occasion, but his smile was the same warm, genuine, and meant only for her. The judge's words washed over her as Preston took her hands in his strong fingers steady against her trembling ones. When the time came to speak her vows, Eleanor's voice was clear and certain, filling the small room with her promise to love, honor, and cherish this man who had seen her value when others had not. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the judge declared, and Preston didn't wait for permission to kiss his bride. His lips found hers with a certainty that made her heart soar, sealing their union with a promise that needed no words. The small gathering celebrated with cake and champagne, offering congratulations and well wishes. As the afternoon wore on, Preston found Eleanor by the window, slipping an arm around her waist. "Mrs. Ryder," he said, testing the name. "How does it sound?" "Perfect," she replied, leaning into his embrace. "Like it was always meant to be mine." "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice low. "The wagon is packed. We can leave whenever you wish." Eleanor glanced out the window toward the town that had been her entire world for 22 years. From this vantage point, she could see the spire of the church, the bustling main street, and in the distance, the small cemetery where her parents lay. For a moment, doubt flickered, was she truly ready to leave it all behind? Then she looked up at Preston, at the love and promise in his eyes, and knew her answer. "I'm ready," she said. "Let's go home." They said their goodbyes to the Wilcoxes, accepting embraces and advice with equal grace. The journey to their new home would take several days, and they planned to camp along the way, beginning their life together under the vast Arizona sky. As they climbed onto the wagon seat, Eleanor glanced back one last time at Old Tucson. She was surprised to find that the bitterness and pain she had carried for so long had eased, replaced by something like gratitude. This place had shaped her, had tested her strength and found it sufficient. But it was no longer her home. Preston followed her gaze, understanding without words. "We leave them behind," he said softly, echoing the words he had spoken to her that day in the hills. "The whispers, the judgments, all of it, they have no place in our future." Eleanor nodded, turning to face forward as Preston snapped the reins. "Our future," she repeated, savoring the words and the promise they contained. The wagon rumbled down the dusty road, heading north toward Flagstaff and the new life awaiting them there. Eleanor leaned against Preston's shoulder, content in a way she hadn't believed possible just months before. The afternoon sun bathed the landscape in golden light, illuminating the path ahead with possibility. Their journey to Flagstaff took 4 days, traveling at a steady pace through the changing Arizona landscape. They camped under the stars each night, learning the rhythms of shared life with both awkwardness and joy. Preston proved to be a patient and tender lover, and Eleanor discovered parts of herself she hadn't known existed in his arms. The cabin Mr. Wilcox had mentioned was indeed sturdy but basic, 2 rooms with a stone fireplace, a hand dug well nearby, and acres of good grazing land stretching in all directions. It sat nestled against a rise of pine-covered hills that reminded Eleanor of the place Preston had first taken her, where he had spoken those fateful words. "We leave them behind." "It's not much," Preston said apologetically as they stood looking at their new home, "but we can improve it over time. Add rooms as we need them." Eleanor squeezed his hand. "It's perfect. It's ours." The first months were not without challenges. The work was hard, the isolation sometimes difficult after town life. But there was a freedom in building something new together, in establishing their home according to their own values rather than others' expectations. Preston proved to be a skilled foreman, earning the respect of the ranch hands under his supervision. Eleanor, drawing on the medical knowledge her father had imparted, began to treat minor ailments and injuries not just for the ranch workers but for neighboring homesteaders as well. Word spread of the doctor's daughter who had her father's gentle hands and healing touch. A year after their wedding, Eleanor gave birth to their first child, a son they named David, after her father. 2 years later, a daughter joined their family, whom they called Rose. The cabin expanded with their growing family, Preston adding rooms with his own hands, creating a home filled with love and laughter. News occasionally reached them from Old Tucson. Dr. Wilson had cleared Eleanor's father's name by presenting evidence that the missing morphine had indeed been used to treat patients who couldn't pay, just as Eleanor had always maintained. The town had erected a small plaque in the doctor's memory, acknowledging his years of service. "Too little, too late," Preston had commented when they received the news. Eleanor had simply nodded, realizing that the vindication she had once desperately craved no longer seemed important. "It doesn't matter now," she had told him. "We've built something better than anything they took from us." 5 years after leaving Old Tucson, on a clear autumn evening, Preston and Eleanor stood on the porch of their home, watching their children play in the yard. The ranch had prospered under Preston's management, and their home had become a gathering place for neighbors and friends who valued their company and skills. "You ever regret it?" Preston asked, his arm around her waist. "Leaving everything behind?" Eleanor looked up at him, at the face that had become as familiar to her as her own, and shook her head. "I didn't leave everything behind. I brought the most important parts with me, my father's knowledge, my mother's strength, and I found the rest here with you." Preston's smile was as warm as it had been that first day in the hills above Old Tucson. "We built something good here, didn't we?" "Something very good," Eleanor agreed, leaning into his embrace. As the sun set over their land, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Eleanor thought about the journey that had brought them here. From whispered accusations and isolation to this place of belonging and purpose, the path had not been straight or easy. But standing here, with the man who had seen her worth when she herself had doubted it, surrounded by the life they had created together, she knew that every step had been necessary. They had left the whispers behind, just as Preston had promised. And in their place, they had found something far more valuable, a love that had the courage to begin again, to build from nothing, to see possibility where others saw only judgment and shame. As darkness fell, they called the children in for supper, moving together into the warmth of their home. The lights from their windows spilled out onto the land around them, a beacon of welcome in the gathering night. Inside, the table was set, the fire crackled in the hearth, and the simple rhythm of family life continued, a life they had created together, far from the whispers of Old Tucson, in a place that was entirely their own. In the years that followed, the Ryder ranch grew and prospered. Preston's fair treatment of his workers and innovative ranching methods earned him a reputation throughout the territory. Eleanor's medical practice expanded as well, her kitchen often serving as a waiting room for those seeking her care. When a proper doctor finally settled in the growing town of Flagstaff, he sought her out as a colleague rather than a competitor, recognizing the value of her experience and knowledge. Their children grew strong and confident, unburdened by the shadows that had once followed their parents. David showed an early aptitude for ranching, riding alongside his father from the time he could sit a horse. Rose revealed a healer's touch like her mother and grandfather, collecting herbs and learning their properties with a natural curiosity that delighted Eleanor. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Preston surprised Eleanor with a trip back to Old Tucson. She had been hesitant at first, uncertain about confronting the place that held so many painful memories. "We don't have to go if you don't want to," Preston had assured her. "But I thought you might want to visit your parents' graves, to show the children where you came from." In the end, she had agreed, recognizing the wisdom in his suggestion. They needed to close this chapter fully, to face the past not as victims but as survivors who had built something meaningful from the ashes of judgment and loss. Old Tucson had changed in the decades since they'd left. New buildings lined the main street, and many of the faces they passed were unfamiliar. But some things remained the same. Mrs. Peterson still ran the general store, and Sheriff Matthews, now gray and stooped, recognized them immediately. "Well, I'll be," he said, extending a weathered hand to Preston. "The Ryders back in town. Heard you've done well for yourselves up north." "We have," Preston confirmed, his arm protectively around Eleanor's shoulders, "just visiting for a few days." Word of their return spread quickly through the town. Eleanor braced herself for the old whispers, the sidelong glances that had once made her daily life a torment. But something unexpected happened instead. People came forward, former patients of her father's, neighbors who had once turned away with words of welcome and apology. "Your daddy treated my boy's fever when no one else would come," one woman told her, tears in her eyes. "I should have spoken up for him when the talk started." "I'm sorry for that. I always knew you'd do well," another claimed, though Eleanor had no recollection of such faith being expressed a decade earlier. She accepted their words with grace, neither rejecting the olive branches nor pretending the past hadn't happened. Standing beside her, Preston watched with quiet pride as his wife navigated these encounters with a dignity that awed him. On their last evening in town, after visiting the cemetery where fresh flowers now adorned her parents' graves, they took supper at the hotel dining room. Halfway through the meal, Eleanor noticed an elderly woman watching them from across the room. "That's Mrs. Holbrook," she whispered to Preston. She was one of the worst gossips, always at the center of any scandal. Preston glanced over, then returned his attention to Eleanor. "Does it bother you, her watching?" Eleanor considered the question, then slowly shook her head. "No," she realized. "It doesn't matter anymore. Her opinion of me, any of their opinions, they're just noise. They don't define me." Preston reached across the table to take her hand. "They never did, Eleanor. You defined yourself through your choices, your courage, your refusal to be broken by their cruelty." That night, as they prepared for bed in their hotel room, Eleanor stood by the window looking out at the town that had once been her entire world. It seemed smaller now, less significant than the life she had built beyond its boundaries. "Thank you," she said softly. Preston looked up from where he was removing his boots. "For what?" "For taking me to the hills that day. For showing me there was a bigger world beyond this town. For saying those words that changed everything." Preston crossed to her, taking her in his arms. "We leave them behind," he quoted, his voice low and intimate. "The best decision I ever made was riding away from here with you beside me." Eleanor leaned into his embrace, thinking of their home waiting for them, the children under Mrs. Wilcox's watchful eye, the ranch hands tending the cattle, the garden she had planted that would be bursting with summer vegetables by now. "Let's go home," she said, and Preston nodded, understanding all that those simple words contained. They left Old Tucson the next morning, the sun rising behind them as they headed north. Eleanor didn't look back this time. The past had been acknowledged, the wounds healed as much as they ever would be. What mattered now was the future they continued to build together, day by day, choice by choice. The wagon rolled steadily northward, carrying them back to the life they had created far from the whispers that had once threatened to destroy Eleanor's spirit. Preston's words from that pivotal day echoed in her mind as the town receded into the distance. "We leave them behind." And they had. With courage and love, they had left behind not just the physical place, but the pain and judgment it represented. In their place, they had built a home, a family, a legacy that would endure long after the whispers had faded to silence. As the familiar landscape of northern Arizona came into view days later, Eleanor felt a sense of homecoming that went beyond the sight of their ranch in the distance. Home wasn't just the cabin they had expanded room by room, or the land that provided their livelihood. Home was the life they had chosen together, the love they had nurtured through good times and bad, the family they had created from nothing but hope and determination. Preston reached for her hand as they approached their property, and Eleanor linked her fingers with his, feeling the familiar calluses that spoke of years of hard work and tender care. "We're home," he said simply. Eleanor nodded, her heart full. "Yes," she agreed. "We're home." And in that moment, with the man who had taught her that love was stronger than judgment beside her, and the life they had built together stretching out before them, Eleanor knew with absolute certainty that they had created something rare and precious, a love that had the courage to begin anew. A family bound not by others' expectations, but by choice and commitment. A home built on the solid foundation of mutual respect and unwavering support. The whispers of Old Tucson were far behind them now, replaced by the sound of their children's laughter as David and Rose ran to greet them, by the welcoming calls of the ranch hands, by the simple, profound peace that came from knowing they were exactly where they were meant to be, with exactly the people they were meant to be with. Together, they had written a new story, not one defined by scandal or shame, but by the resilience of the human spirit and the transformative power of love that sees beyond judgment to the truth of a person's character. It was a story still being written, day by day, in the choices they made and the life they shared. And as Eleanor stepped down from the wagon into the waiting embrace of her children, with Preston's steady presence beside her. She knew it was the story she had always been meant to live, not as the disgraced doctor's daughter, defined by others' whispers, but as Eleanor Ryder, a woman who had found the courage to leave the past behind and build a future filled with purpose, joy, and abiding love.